Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today is truly a special day in the niche micro celebrity era. Truly, it is. We are joined by the world famous Settlers Lament and the world's most reactionary Canadian artist, Gio Pinochet. How are you doing today, gentlemen?
Jed Oh, your CMP is gonna come to my house now. Um, you go ahead, Settler. You go first. You go first. I'm like
Yeah,
trying
I
to
mean, yeah,
save the
I
show.
don't even I don't know if like any introduction's really necessary. I am the one, the only, the world famous Settlers Lament. As I have said on my Twitter recently, it is so funny how my opponents are all morons and losers and nerds, and I am so handsome and loved and smart. But yeah, no, I mean everyone knows me. All my minions, they love me. Other people, they even have to steal my minions. Like there's this one loser. His name's called like American Elitist or something like that, and he's leeching off my one of my main minions, Cringe Walker. Um,
Uh,
and but no, it's fine. It's fine. I have the best minions. I can understand why others would want to use my minions. I'm not going to hate. But I would say it is very nice being here today because, as I always say, I, Settlers Lament, have the stupidest audience in the world. So it's very nice to be on other people's channel because, that doesn't necessarily mean your audience is smart. But since mine is just the worst audience, it just necessarily means it's at least slightly less stupid than my own audience.
It isn't just Kitch when he says that, though. He is truly world famous because nobody can just like shit on their audience so much, and yet they like support him endlessly. As Settlers
Yeah, no, I
Lament.
mean my audience. I mean, one. Let's be clear here. I do not appreciate the dirty language, AE. But beyond that, I yeah, my audience, they love me. I'm world famous. They adore me. It doesn't matter what I say. I mean, I just tell the truth. I'm not trying to attack them. Like, I wish my audience was smart. Do you think I appreciate having the stupidest audience in the world? I don't. I wish they were smart. But I just got to tell it like it is. Maybe one day they'll be smart.
Man, this is like a Maxwell Jacob Friedman promo. This is amazing. This could headline. This could headline Collision, which is happening. Which is for wrestling fans. Apparently, it's happening in Toronto, in Tirana, Collision, which I will not go to because I do not want to support all estrogen wrestling. But that was great, Sellers Cement. That's like spoony levels of like miturating upon your audience. I have a pretty cool audience. My audience are pretty heavy hitters intellectually. They're all theory. They're all word. They're all word cells that live in their basement, just like me. So it's like I think I truly believe that a content creator is a grand filter for their audience in a way. You really get the audience that you attract. They are part of you, and you are a part of them. But you're not responsible for them because that's a libtarded argument. So that's a different matter. That's like an iDubbbz argument right there. But anyways, American Pops, thank you for having me on. So Sellers, man, you're an old head. I remember watching you years ago. Um,
I
you've
mean,
been
like
around
three
for a
years. I
while.
think I wouldn't like. I guess I think of people like the distributors as being the old ones.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
Um,
But
but yeah, I mean, I've been around for a bit.
oh yeah, as
I
I
mean,
have.
he's world famous from his like Vouch video, that he made a while ago. You should make more of that.
Oh, I think I remember that one. I
His
think
critique. I
I'm
remember
well, I'm an old
him.
head.
Yeah, him and this other guy called Red Pill Shark. I don't know if you remember him, who was Canadian. I remember them back in the old alt right days on the internet. I
I'm
remember
going to
the
be I'm going to be
this.
honest. I don't think I've ever heard of a red pill shark in my entire life.
No, I know. I don't know what happened to this guy. I guess he disappeared off the face of the earth, but he had a lot of subscribers. They had like 20,000 or something. But I remember I remember he made a video, and it was like when Justin Trudeau, got elected for like the first or second time again, and he was like, we need the Tories to get back in charge so the world takes Canada seriously like they should. And I remember I just burst out laughing because that just was inherently a contradiction because nobody takes Canada seriously in reality.
Oh, oof.
But regardless of the bullying from America, we need to talk about your gay political structure here,
Speaking of bullying for America,
you know, because, unlike us, you guys don't actually have a right, or anyone who actually claims to be right wing in your political party. You basically have sodomy, and conservative sodomy. And that's the two choices. At least with our sodomy, you get some defectors who are not as pro sodomy, and that's the main political distinction that we see here. I mean, do you think I'm kind of off? Is that a simplification, Gio?
Well, oh boy. Well, it's more or less. I mean, yeah, the Conservative Party conservative. See, the Republican Party in America is a very unique aberration in terms of the Anglosphere. And yes, I know a lot of Americans don't like to hear that, but you are a part of the Anglosphere. The Conservative Party in Canada, as it is in Great Britain, as it is in Ireland and New Zealand and Australia, is basically has taken on this sort of like right flank of the end of history liberalism, more or less. And so, for example, a few days ago, I believe we crossed over into 40 million people, and Pierre Palaver is like, well, this is a great accomplishment. It's the typical like conservative, immigrants are more Canadian than Canadians, blah, blah, blah. And so, yeah, basically, there really is no opposition. There is no creation of a quote unquote right wing in Canada, because the political terms of what a right wing is has been so distorted either by American liberalism or the sort of like remnants of that Anglosphere system from Britain. And like basically, by the time you get to the 60s, and this is George Grant's thesis, by the time you get to the 60s with Trudeau Sr., it's all Joe over. It's like the meaningful political distinction in Canada, I mean, was still lingering a little bit. But by the time you get to like Brian Mulroney, it's either like, American style neoliberalism, where conservatism is defined as like this economism, more or less. And it's like this, like, what do you call in the States where you have like, like you have a blue dog, right? But what's the Republican equivalent?
Dino.
Yeah, rhinos. Yeah. Like, or I guess you just call the rhinos. Like,
yeah.
The Canadian Conservatives essentially like this rhino like state where they can only advance like a sort of marginal policies in terms of economic interests, and like maybe they'll have some kind of like symbolic thing, like we're gonna ease up a little bit on gun control, and then like stuff like that. But really at its core, Canada pretty much is, in my thesis anyways, as much as it's a post-historical, post-national state, is a post-political state. We do managerialism even better than America in some ways, in terms of getting and sort of neutering political difference. There's only like that one view of what it means to administer the Canadian state, or post-state, whatever, anti-state, and it's just like haggling over how to do it. But those fundamentally transformative social issues, those are gone. Like, I'm sorry, like it's Joe over,
It's so Joe over.
Well, yeah, you're never going to propose like immigration in particular. See, Canada used to be way better in terms of immigration, but it's just like this is the prerogative of the end of history state in Canada, and so therefore any advancement in that direction is not going to happen. Even Maxime Bernier would be considered like a mild, like he'd be like a Mitch McConnell in America, more or less. But in terms of like, I mean, not necessarily, but like, in terms of these fundamental issues that define a civilization, Canada is very much like in the back view of it, because our political leadership class decided these issues are over with a very long time ago. And
so
go ahead, Scholars. Go ahead.
So the distinction I'd like to draw here, because there's actually two different trends I think you're picking up on in Canadian history that are related but not identical. One would be the sort of drive towards social liberalism, and the other would be the sort of destruction of sort of classical Canadian right-wing thought. And those aren't identical things, or they're closely related, because you said that it was like basically over by the time of Mulroney. In a certain sense, that's true when we mean like the classic distinctions of what made like sort of traditional Canadian English Toryism. That was all completely destroyed by Mulroney. The sort of easiest way of demonstrating this is in early Canadian history, for Canadians who don't know their own history, and for everyone else who is unaware of Canadian history. the earliest political distinction in Canada after Confederation was between the Conservatives and the Liberals, and basically there were ongoing political battles between both parties for like the first for really the first century of Canada, but especially for the first 50 or so years of Canada after Confederation over the issue of American integration. And the way this was primarily battled over in practical terms was tariffs, whether or not Canada should maintain a high level of tariffs to prevent American economic integration, or if Canada should reduce those tariffs because Canada's economic future necessarily was tied into the continent and not with Great Britain. And the Conservatives were the pro-tariff party, and the Liberals were the anti-tariff party, more or less. Now, there's lots of complications to this. The Conservatives still did propose trade deals, and the Liberals did go back and forth on this. But generally speaking, when these big fights happened, the Conservatives were pro-tariff and the Liberals were anti-tariff. And the Liberals were defeated on this point every single time in early Canadian history. The Liberals in 1891 were completely destroyed on this issue. That was the last election that Macdonald ran in before he died shortly after the election. And then the Liberal Party under Laurier just decided after that this just wasn't a fight worth having, and they abandoned the tariff issue. And the Liberal Party continued to abandon it for another 20 or so years until Laurier himself, the one who moved the Liberal Party away from the tariff issue, brought it back to the forefront in 1911. At which point he was kicked out of power, and the Liberal Party spent a decade in opposition for this very same thing that had destroyed them 20 years prior, the issue of championing free trade. So to connect this to Brian Mulroney, classical Canadian conservative thought would have placed a high value on stuff like tariffs and on certain economic measures to maintain Canada's independence from the United States and to maintain Canada's distinctiveness. George Grant and other classical Canadian conservative figures always emphasized how it was the Conservative Party, not the Liberal Party, who started things like the CBC and Ontario Hydro and all those sorts of big government programs, as like the right wing Liberals would call them nowadays. They were started by the Conservatives, not the Liberals, as an effort to build up the Canadian nation and defend it from American influences.
Shocking, Like shocking.
Yeah, and this isn't anything specific to Canadian conservatism. That this was common in really just Anglosphere conservatism in general. The sort of like extreme economic liberalism we're familiar with comes from, as the word implies, from liberals, not from conservatives. It's just as conservatives were gradually destroyed, sort of center-right liberals replaced conservatives. But to bring this back to Mulroney, by the time of Mulroney, this classical Canadian conservative thought in economics is completely destroyed. No survivors. It's just it's completely eviscerated. And the way we see this most practically is Mulroney fought an election, his second election as prime minister, on the very issue of the tariff. Only he was on the opposite side that every other conservative had ever been in the past. He was the pro-tariff prime minister, and the Liberals and NDP were the ones who were against free trade. So by the time of Mulroney, we see a complete inversion on the sort of classical Canadian economic thought, and it's the Liberals who are accusing the Conservatives of wanting to bring about economic integration with the United States. The Liberal Party had an excellent ad on this where it had like two guys sitting over a boardroom table, and the American said, like, the contract looks good, but we just need to get rid of this one line. And then it zooms in and it shows a map between Canada and the United States, and the line is the border between Canada and the United States that they're erasing. And the Conservatives won that election. They won it much more narrowly than Mulroney won his first election, but they did ultimately win that election. And that I think, like, I want to be clear that when I talk about the sort of classical Canadian conservative view on economics, it's bigger than just tariffs, but tariffs is just the sort of main aspect of it, historically at least. So there is more to this. I already feel like I'm going on for a bit, so I don't need to get into other specifics too much. But my point is, by the time of Mulroney, this element of Canadian conservatism is completely destroyed. That said, though, what you also tied this to was the issue of social conservatism. And the history of that is actually a bit more complicated because, now we all know today Canada is very socially liberal. Canada has the most radical abortion laws in really the world, with North Korea being the only other country that is as permissive on abortion as Canada, as far as I know. Even places that are generally considered quite permissive on abortion are nowhere near as bad as
It's
Canada,
Canadian
I know. I
countries,
mean, there
yeah.
might be a few states in the US that are as bad, but it's very rare for a place to be as permissive as Canada on abortion. That is that abortion is legal through all 9 months. But
No, it was
but
never this way. No, it was like this is uniquely more of a modern Canadian phenomenon.
yes,
We
yeah,
were actually
and
more
that's why I bring this
socially
back to
conservative.
Mulrooney
Yeah,
because
go ahead, go ahead.
because during the Mulrooney days, though when it came to the sort of economic issues, the classical Canadian rights completely destroyed. That actually wasn't true yet when it came to social issues. Canada actually. At that point was not nearly as radical. In particular, Mulrooney almost passed what would have been one of the most radical abortion bans in the entire Western world. Granted, it wouldn't have been as radical as, like, say, Ireland's laws from back then.
Yeah.
But still, the laws that were proposed under Mulrooney were very strict, much stricter than what exists in even many conservative states now after Roe. In the U.S. And certainly stricter than what exists in most Western countries, where in most of Europe, for example, the average is usually about 12 weeks. The laws under Mulrooney were much stricter than that. And that was only, and this wasn't just something that Mulrooney proposed, but like never had a chance of being passed. It was passed, and it was just shot down in the Senate because it was a tie vote, and if it's a tie vote in the Senate, then it fails to pass. So the issue of serious abortion bans in Canada was actually still a live issue, and in general, Canada was not in the 80s and early 90s. Canada was not this crazy, extreme social liberal place that it has since become. That actually is a more modern development, and I do think you can trace a certain development from the economic issues that we're discussing, from Canada becoming an American colony and Canada losing its independence. I'm not saying those things are disconnected, but these are actually somewhat separate trends. Is just the important thing that I want to emphasize.
Yeah, it's like what I remember. I was talking about this with T.A. Jackson back in the day. I hope he comes back to Twitter. He's like, the diffusion of social liberalism into Canada by America is very interesting because America itself has sort of like crumple zones or pockets of, for lack of a better term, like reactionary, like realpolitik, a lot of the South, for example. But Canada, by the time it came to our shores, it was like, across the border, there was really no natural defense mechanism just by the shape of the way that Canada had manifested, from its like post-royalist days. And it's like, it's very interesting how now that we're sort of like still like the liberals are sort of like the Americanist party, even though that we don't think of it this way, because we think of like in like this the sort of like very incredibly recent libertariation of Canadian politics thinks of as like America as like this reactionary right wing Jesus land, and it's like they got rid of Roe v. Wade and all this crap. But when you really think of it, the current iteration of the liberals still have this sort of like Americanism in the terms of like, when you look at the average like Canadian libtard, when you look at like the left wing in Canada, I mean, it just mimics a more extreme version of any sort of like Democrat hipster DSA voter in America. And so still like in some like weird way being like trying to like out liberal America, trying to like out socially liberal America is still kind of like being in like the Liberal Party being in the grips of like the Americanization of Canada, because like really them adopting this like very far left social agenda and basically destroying the relevance of the NDP. It's really quite something in a way. But like, like Settler, like you were saying, like given the historical context, Canada is like does have a quite fascinating political history in terms of the ideology. But then again, there's the argument that like this was inevitable because America in the 1900s certainly wasn't the juggernaut that it became. And it's like there's always that debate. And again, like, this is why Grant calls it Lament of the Nation, because there's some kind of fatalism in it. Whether or not Canadians can resuscitate any unique identity that would instantiate like a sense of what being a Canadian is, besides the ephemera of like minor differences between Canadians and Americans. I mean, that's certainly up for debate. I mean, certainly don't want to black pill too much, but I think that that history and that sense of what an identity is certainly been lost or eroded over the years. And now being Canadian is I don't know, being like when you define
It's
identity as
almost
an
like
absence,
it's almost like this like lab, basically where the liberal thinkers at Berkeley and Yale can just like dream up the most like fanciful leftist progressive vision and like just kind of pour the chemicals out. And that's basically what Canada is. And that's
I
basically how
would
it
say
functions.
I would say I would like to nuance this a bit when it comes to like how extreme Canada is. I would say that Canada, when it comes to left-wingedness on social policy, is as left-wing as the Soviet Union was left-wing on economic policy. Though I would say basically the same is true for the United States and most Western countries in general. I
Yeah.
mean, I would say the issue of gay marriage alone is just as radical as any economic policy in the Soviet Union. I wouldn't even necessarily say the same about abortion because infanticide historically is extremely common. But gay marriage is just such a fundamentally radical misunderstanding of human nature that it's just as extreme as any as anything that was believed in the Soviet Union in terms of economic policy. But that said, I mean, you know, in a certain sense, you say that like Canada is run by people like DSA voters from the United States. I mean, there's some truth to that. But I would say actually, I think Canada's economic policy, all things considered, is relatively moderate. Yeah, the Liberal Party spends tons of money. They get in tons of debt. As critical as I am of a lot of center-right conservative talking points, I do think accruing massive amounts of debt is a bad thing. That is one agreement I still have with the center-right in general. But I wouldn't. I don't think there's really actually anything that particularly radical about Canadian economic policy. It's not in any ways like even say the famed, glorious, amazing Scandinavian socialism. Canada, other than the issue of our healthcare system being quite a bit more progressive than the United States healthcare system, is really not any more left wing when it comes to economics than the more left wing American states.
It depends. Like again, if you're defining it in terms of like American liberalism, then no, I mean we're pretty much equal. If not, I mean we have. I know, like during the Harper years, there was a bit better management. For example, the housing crisis was more or less avoided or deferred. But yeah, go ahead, Settler. Go ahead. Yeah, I would.
That's most of what I said. But I just there is actually a this is something that when I was younger I would hear left wingers say all the time, that the Liberal Party campaigns from the left and governs from the right, and it would always annoy me. I always think it was ridiculous. But I do think there's actually a lot of truth to that, as long as we understand that when people say that they're referring to economic issues and not social issues. That the Liberal Party is actually, I'd say, all things considered, very moderate. I think in many ways you could say the Conservative Party in the UK can be more left-wing economically than the Canadian Liberal Party, or at least they're very comparable. There really is. I would say when it comes to economic issues alone, Canada would generally be considered fairly center-right by European standards. That Canadian economic policies are only ever really considered radical when compared to the United States, and this is usually just on the issue of tuition or healthcare. So it's like, is Canada run by DSA voters? Yeah, I mean, with the understanding that DSA voters are really actually primarily concerned about social issues, not economic issues. They might talk about economic issues a lot. There might be some of them that is really what they're most concerned about. But really, your average DSA voter, what they're actually get most angry at, what they're going to scream at someone about, is not about whether or not they support tax cuts, but it's about gender stuff or sex stuff or any of that type of stuff. So they are. It's just you have to look at what a DSA voter actually is, and not the propaganda of what they claim to be.
Exactly. Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, I was more so referring to the social issues. Economically, I mean, we're pretty on par, if not a bit better than America. I mean, like in some ways, America has like a lot of like very, very weird and Baroquean sort of tax systems and so forth, and a lot of it comes from the federalist system that they have. But and then I mean, I guess there's also like some other issues. I mean, we're certainly have more like of a economically it was much more of a centralized system. But besides that,
well, the reason I called it like the test lab for Berkeley is just like because of this phenomenon of just like basically like celebrating people, the suicide pod, like just like mainstreaming that. And Gio, do you remember that ad they came up with, like that spiritual, just like this, like almost, I can't think of another like satanic, like just like celebrating this like beautiful thing of like getting in the suicide pod, like Klaus Schwab vision of the world. Like it's like, where do you think that comes from? Besides like Berkeley, like liberal think tanks, it's just like. That's why it like seems very strange.
But it really depends. I mean, a lot of the things that, like, I always say this, a lot of things that Americans poke fun of at Canada. I mean, just wait a few years. Don't worry about it. It's gonna there will be it won't be as like the veracity of it certainly won't be as impactful. And I can't begin to imagine a lot of Midwestern or Southern states adopting it, but I do see it like a made light program in America in a few years. I mean, in Oregon, look at like Oregon. I think New York has somewhat of it, but like in Canada, it is like such a very like we're going to clear the deadwood of like old people or like the original stock of Canada, and then we're gonna the new Canadians are gonna come. It's like there's
Yeah, I mean,
there's a form of
so you
malevolence
say,
to it. Yeah.
so you say that like you don't expect these things to come to the more conservative states in the U.S. And I understand what you said, and maybe politics are actually changing, and maybe you're right. But I'm very skeptical of this because I remember when I was much younger. I remember the days before Obergefell in the United States, and I remember thinking that like if they tried to impose like gay marriage on like Texas and Oklahoma and
Yeah.
Alabama, there's no way they'll stand for that. Like the governors and stuff will just say no, we absolutely refuse to enforce this, even if the federal government or the courts whatever tell them they have to. And it happened, and then you had like one clerk in the entire country that refused to enforce it. So I mean, I think it could be very likely that we will have the Supreme Court one day. Now, of course, Trump did get a lot of great nominees in, so perhaps that will put the brakes on it for a while. But still, all it takes is a couple people to get old and have heart attacks or have to retire, something like that.
Yeah.
And the court has is like 5-4 or 6-3 conservative, but it doesn't take very long for that to change. And then you could have the Supreme Court enforce something like made on the entire country. And I think we just know from history so far that the United States is that the conservative states are not going to just say no. That if the federal government forces it, they will accept it. So yeah, I mean, it starts with the most liberal states. This is one of the because Americans do really like to make fun of Canadians for how like crazy and liberal we are. I do think it's important to emphasize that this stuff almost always starts in the United States and then is exported to Canada as as you said, AE as the sort of test lab for people in Berkeley, where like Oregon had radical euthanasia laws long before Canada did. But I do think these are things that very likely could be imposed on the entire United States, barring significant changes happening.
I want to clarify my point. I didn't mean like conservative states are going to resist this ending. I don't think that's going to happen at all. I think we saw that with COVID, that simply is a fantasy. They'll cave instantly.
No, but I do think.
But I just mean like
it, though. I think yeah, go ahead.
Like the absolute insane ideas and like the furthest advances of the sort of the WEF and like libtard ideas will be the chemicals will essentially be poured out in Canada first. Since that's the most like expedited province of the empire, and that'll essentially be the vision of the future. But it seems like the lab is like centered there first, and it's kind of like tested there and kind of put out, so to speak. I don't know if you get that feeling as well. That's just what I meant to say. I don't mean red states are going to resist this in any meaningful way. They won't. They'll embrace conservative sodomy.
No, I think that what I meant was I think that there was during the Covidian era there was a sort of like, in a sense, like I'm thinking of DeSantis, even though he's totally soiled himself by becoming like an establishment guy. I think like if he would have continued on his trajectory of just being a good governor of Florida, I think there was an ability for like conservative states or republic or whatever you want to call them, just like have a real instantiation of regionalism in America, where you would like just basically, if you had a more weakened central government under Biden or whoever, that they could just say no to certain things. But I mean that's probably the Covidian thing probably was an aberration now that I look back on it. Certainly Florida, but you never know. I mean, it's tough. I don't want to black pill too much, but for Americans and Canadians, but it's tough. It's hard times, baby.
I would like to say for the black pill that I actually do not. I am lament pilled, but I am not black pilled. I have said for a long time I am post black pilled. I took the
Oh
black
man.
pill so hard that I'm just beyond the black pill now. Because I do think that the final white pill, beyond just Jesus, is that is that actually like this all just can't last. That I think the comparison to the Soviet Union is always a very apt one. Not that I'm saying that Canada or the United States or Western countries in general have the same sort of extreme totalitarian controls that the Soviet Union had. I don't think we do, and I know a lot of sort of boomer cons will talk about this as though we're like just any minute away from having like NKVD agents marching us off, stuff like that. I think it actually is really the way it has to go because they're able.
No, exactly.
Because they're able to control us so effectively through social pressure, through sexual blackmail, through all the types of stuff we're generally familiar with. That it's not necessary to have the same sort of extreme totalitarian controls that exist in the Soviet Union. So when I say this, I don't want people to misunderstand me and say that that's what I'm referring to when I talk about the Soviet Union. I'm not. What I'm talking about is, as I said previously, that our social policy is as radically left-wing. I think it's something we really need to internalize, that our social policy is as radically left-wing as the Soviet Union ever was. That if you compare our views on any of these sort of social issues, on euthanasia, on sex, on any of these sorts of things, to the historic view, it is just as unnatural, as extreme, as unlike anything historically, as communism was economically. And I think the white pill there, because that might sound like a black pill, it is a black pill, but getting past that black pill, the white pill there is realizing that the reason ultimately that communism failed was not because Ronald Reagan was just so epic and punched down the Berlin Wall. It was not even because St. John Paul II was just so epic. That the reason that that communism failed was because communism was just so unnatural. It's just so not coherent with human nature and the natural law, that it was something that ultimately couldn't succeed, that it had to fall apart eventually. And in that same sense, the sort of radical social policy that we have, I don't think it's something that that nations can survive on indefinitely. That at some point it just can't keep on going on because it's so discontinuous with human nature.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that we're in a period of oh god, who is the what was his name? He was in the he was mentioned in the Adam Curtis documentary. That invented the term hypernormalization. If someone in the chat could, Tuesday, help me out. I know you know this. It's embarrassing because I think like one of my essays in my book I cited him. But I think we're in that period of hypernormalization where the absurdity of the regime is met with the insanity of everyday life, of living through the regime, that because you can't imagine an outside system until that the infrastructure of the system itself collapses, then you're going to like get people just going along with it because they can't envision anything else. They know it's bullshit, but then that's like the essence of hypernormalization, is that there's such a powerful sort of cordycepting of people's perceptions and awareness and ideas and sort of inner motivations through this system that they really can't envision anything else, even though they sort of have seen the magician's trick. The wool isn't pulling over their eyes anymore. They still persist in going along with it. Now, I don't think perhaps yeah, you're Chuck. There you go. Thank you, that dude. Alexi, you're Chuck. Yeah. I don't think Canadians are at that level, but certainly a lot of Americans are, and like maybe a growing amount of Canadians are. And who knows? I mean, that's probably, we're going to have to take the surfer pill in a while, for a while. We're going to have to like ride the tiger, if you will, as cliched and as like the 2016 old head phrase as that is, being an old head. I think, yeah, it's more or less correct. I think that in times before collapse, you will experience immense insanity in all things. And I think that probably explains our modern politics. And as for like Settlers saying that, they don't exactly need to shove a Kalashnikov in your face. I mean, they don't, because they're like, even someone of a good conscience. Like I remember just today I was seeing this video, and I know this is like the most popular thing, the trans issue. I was seeing this video of like this like liberal mother with like a trans child, like an M2F, right? And the father's like, you could tell like he's devastated. He knows like if he says anything, it's over. His life is done for. and he just like he's like, well, and he looks dead in the eyes, dead in the eyes. If you can find this TikTok on Twitter, it's there. And he's like, well, I don't want to like become, I don't want to like become her first bully, and I think it's like we have to go along with this because I can't say it's like the typical like very weak-willed, unfortunately like boomer or like earlier Gen X parent. It's like, that really is a testament, I think, to the ideological capture of the system more than just a commissar telling you what to do or believe. I mean, that model of power is like so truncated that it's irrelevant. The modern mode of power is like a father losing control of his own son because he married like a libtarded woman, and because the sort of the social apparatus around him would absolutely crucify him in that like 60-second TikTok if he said anything negative about it, even though you could tell in his eyes. He'll probably still get canceled just by the look in his eyes that he's like, well, I actually don't agree with this, but I have to go along with this. That's just one example I saw today. I don't know if I'm trailing off into a tangent, but yeah,
No, it's like they don't need the gun. Like, I mean, like, honestly, guys, like, they got like the microplastics and the soy in your lattes that you're drinking, and they got Call
there's
of
that
Duty.
too.
It's like Call of Duty and like Starbucks have, are far better controlling mechanisms than the AK. And I say this as a person who likes the AKs personally, but it's just like people don't understand like how sophisticated the mind control actually is now. And the guns aren't needed anymore. This LARP that we're gonna kind of retake, the West, with the gun is foolish.
We're gonna put twigs in our hair and call ourselves the Wolverines and go in the woods, yeah, like Red Dawn.
Oh, Gio, I have to bring up this comment. Do you think that the gay is actually going to go in this direction? Suicide Pod marketing direction to Pajits. Expedite your reincarnation. Do you think that's too kitsch?
No, that's too much, because if I recall, like, it depends on which sect of Hinduism. I mean, you can't really force reincarnation that way. No, that I think that that would create a lot of social contradictions that we're seeing in America with Muslims, for example, who send their kids to school. But like, the problem with that is that for a while, I think, like, especially in Canada, conservatives will probably like snicker and like it'll be an epic meme on Rebel News where it's like, well, see, the Hindus are fighting back. The based epic trad right-wing Hindus, they're
natural conservatives, natural conservatives.
So, yeah, no, but so if they do try to like make inroads into any other community besides like Anglophone or Francophone Canadians when it comes to the MAID program, then you'll just have the same sort of like ideological capture that you have in America with Muslims and with other communities like Hispanics and so forth, where it's like, yeah, they don't want their kids to be trans, but then in a few generations, I don't know, there's a lot of like very, there's a lot of like progressive hijabi, like 5th generation diaspora Muslim women in America who like their biggest idol is like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and AOC, but they still like wear, they wear the veil, right? But so I think like this like subletting of baseness by conservatives in North America to like, based immigrants, it's sort of like not really the point. I mean, for a time they'll probably, if they make a stink, then yeah, okay. But that's like, I don't know, like the whole like Rebel News, like David Menzies epic own type of content, that isn't going to create a meaningful right wing in Canada, or a meaningful alternative, or at least a sense of high Toryism that can differentiate us from America. That's just going to be like, the typical narrative of like, well, I guess they're better than Canadians because they're like new Canadians are better than Canadians because they're more socially conservative than like most like white liberals in Canada. And it's like, well, I don't know. That's sort of besides the point. What do you think, Settler? Do you think they're gonna do some kind of like weird marketing?
Well, yeah, I mean, the unfortunate reality is that that even generally conservative immigrant groups are very effectively turned liberal by Western propaganda pretty rapidly. So it's all just sort of superfluous. It's Western society as it exists currently that makes people liberal. It's not that there's like something crazy with white people. So so if you so if you get a lot of immigrants that are actually socially conservative, which all groups aren't necessarily, but if you do, then they just in a generation or two become just as socially liberal as the rest of Canada, and that's just generally the case. I don't think it's really ever very often the case. I mean, there might be some particular niche immigrant groups that are able to carry on social conservatism intergenerationally, but even the religious groups, it's not something that they maintain long term. I mean, I grew up going to school with Muslims and other groups like that, and they were not remarkable for social conservatism.
Oh yeah, definitely.
No, and also this like trite point from conservatards that's like, but based immigrants who are natural conservatives, and I hear this point from boomers and Gen Xers. It's just like, well, even if there is that like tiny group of people, it's like, well, yeah, okay, one drop of water out of the flood that's just coming in, that's all liberal. It's just like that isn't the own that's not even the cope that you think it is. It's just like they're like the conservatards are so cocked that like their copes don't even really work. It's like the cope doesn't really justify itself. It's just like all what the cope really does is to serve to justify the mental justification of like, that meme of like, can you just stop beating the shit out of me? Can you just beat the shit out of me just a little bit less? That's basically what modern conservatives are,
Well, like even in America, like Asians, for instance, I mean, it was a tactic on certain elements of the right, even where it's like, if you just show like Central Asians and Central and Far Eastern Asians, if you just show them enough videos of like, certain urban
socialism,
or like certain urban youths like beating them up in the subways, or if like you reverse the discrimination policies of Ivy League institutions. I mean, if I recall statistically, I think they still overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, except for like in certain pockets of like red states. And I don't know in Canada. I think there is a large contingent of Sikhs that vote conservative, but there is also a large contingent that vote for NDP. I mean, that's just a uniquely Ontario phenomenon thing. But no, I mean, like, yeah, it's like you're never going to truly expect like the outside to reinstantiate your own version of civilization, nor would you expect. I mean, there are certain like Western boos in Asia that like, what are you going to do? They're going to like, American liberalism, unless you're Logo de Atlas, and you believe that American republicanism is going to be reborn in China and some like ridiculous thing like that. You wouldn't expect that of anyone else. I mean, outside of the colonial context, obviously, but it's like, yeah, it's the same. I think it's because a lot of it, when it comes to conservatives in America and Canada, in North America in general, a little bit more with America, because America has dominance over the geopolitical considerations of our region of the world. You have this like weird subletting of the fantasies of the conservatives. And this came from a thread of my good friend Kashawagi, who said this, that like, conservatives in North America will sort of like sublet their desires for control onto geopolitics. So either it's like based immigrants do the job that I can't do, or it's like other conflictual states in the world will do this job for me. So for example, like the revival of like, anti-communist like Russophobia is like a good example of like, like, oh, they're not exactly the Soviet Union, but I guess they're kind of like the Soviet Union. So it's like this weird form of like patriotism that's applied to the outside, because you can't dare question like the social liberals in your own country. You can't dare fight your own culture war. So those like sort of triumphalist politics have to be externalized onto a geopolitical context. That certain nation in the Middle East obviously is like a good example of that, but like without getting too much into those weeds. But yeah, I mean, even I remember even under Harper, like conservatives in Canada would do this thing where it's like, like besides the base minorities, like they would also do the whole like, this current like conflict around the world is just because it's like we're imposing our will upon them and blah blah blah. And it's like, yeah, it's just it's a sort of like pseudo activity for the lack of responsibility that these ostensibly conservative or right-wing parties in North America have basically abdicated their Am I saying it right?
Abrogated, yes.
Abrogated the responsibility, to their own constituents, to their own civilization.
I
Really,
think you mean abdicated.
abdicated. Yeah, sorry. Or there's another
Abrogated
word.
it or whatever. It means the same thing.
Or obvious. Obviated is a good word too. Obviated their own responsibility to their own civilization and to their own let alone their own voters. I mean, conservatives in Canada, for example, I mean, Settler, you could comment on this, have always had this weirdo relationship with social conservative branch that came in after reform in the 90s, and Harper had to suppress those people, and
Yeah, no, again, it's again, I think it is still important to emphasize how recent the sort of extreme Canadian social liberalism is. That even Harper's first election when he became prime minister in 2000, or not, I mean, he ran he ran in the general election in 2003, I think, also, but he didn't become prime minister that one. But the first one where he did become prime minister in 2006, during that campaign, he ran against gay marriage. Now, of course, he had a minority, so he had no real chance of actually repealing it. And I think even if he had a majority, I doubt that would have happened. But my point is, in 2006 in Canada, opposing gay marriage was still the assumed position of the Conservative Party, even if it was something that they weren't actually going to go through with. So I just think it's sort of now the Conservative Party posts pride flags and stuff like that. But again, the extremity of how social liberal Canada is a quite recent phenomenon. And the complete collapse of any sort of meaningful social conservative movement in Canada, this again is quite recent. So I think it's very easy for us to sort of project this back in time. And I think it's just very important for us to understand that's actually not the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think in some ways that's a great failure of the Harper regime, in the sense that he pursued that same form of iron fist managerialism above the issues that actually did animate his base. And so now, in Canada, you'll have
and I mean, I
commentary,
think probably the best example of this would be the issue of the courts, where we see the biggest success that conservatives have had in the United States is from Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump appointing as many conservative justices to the courts as they possibly could. Now, of course, the courts don't have as important of a role in Canada as they do in the United States, but they still have a very important role.
Oh, yeah.
Parliamentary supremacy does change that slightly, but still, the courts have played an outside influence more than they probably should, given our constitutional arrangement in Canada. And Harper did absolutely nothing serious to try to ensure that the courts had the sort of conservative dominance that has occurred because of Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump in the United States. And Harper was in power for almost 10 years. Harper could have, if I recall correctly, I think by the end of when Harper was prime minister, he had appointed the majority of members of the Supreme Court of Canada, but they were all liberals. He did not appoint anyone that had meaningful ideological differences from who the liberals would have appointed. And that is one of the most lasting elements of his legacy, where I mean, he managed certain elements of Canada's economy slightly better than the liberals would have. He balanced the budget. I mean, that's nice. As many disagreements as I have with the sort of center right mainstream on economics, I still think the balancing the budget was nice, and I still think some of the symbolic things he did, like restoring the royal honors to the Air Force and the Navy, are nice, but these are all ultimately quite small things. He didn't go for the big things when he had the chance.
Yeah, and I think it's really just to pursue again, a pure managerialism, that the appointments to the court were that of well, they're the best qualified, but it's he didn't really see the political game for what it was, because I think that, well, first of all, Harper, I mean, he wasn't exactly he had to wrestle the sort of Reform Party people, in the West, but he was part of the Citizens Coalition. He was basically I guess you would say a libertarian, a neoliberal libertarian, but he did really emphasize some of the red meat in in an American context, the sort of tax cuts thing, and other issues that they're sort of bracketed off from the core of what social conservatism is. And there were times where he legit just repressed those people in his own cabinet. They would talk about banning certain elements of abortion, and it's like it would never go anywhere. And it's so but at the end of the day, Harper, I mean, compared to like the 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 ruling class nowadays, I mean, he would almost be like a breath of fresh air if he came back.
I mean, I don't. I mean, so on one hand, Harper is just sort of like a sort of like generally inoffensive, nice guy. You know, he's sort of
Yeah.
nostalgic for me.
But he was portrayed as like an evil right-wing monster for a time by the media.
Yeah, no, I mean I mean, basically the propaganda I got when I was younger was that like George Bush is like Adolf Hitler of our generation. I mean, people would literally say
and Harper's like Mussolini.
But I want to be really clear for people that aren't old enough to remember this. When I say that they would say that that George Bush was Adolf Hitler of our generation, like I am not exaggerating. People would literally say stuff like, you know, in the 1930s they had Hitler, today we have George Bush, and that like Hitler did what he did, and George Bush did the same types of things to in his wars.
People in Katrina in the Middle East.
That Bush was a genocidal maniac. So it's not like you know, I feel like some people might think that the Trump stuff is unique. It really is not unique at all.
But now George Bush is like a mushy liberal that they love because he paints pictures of migrants.
Perhaps the outrage at Trump is unique in degree, but not in kind. It's only a bit more extreme than the sort of outrage that was given against Bush. And I mean, of course, to be clear, like I don't even support the Iraq War or anything. I'm just saying that like the context of these criticisms are just insane. But yeah, so similarly, yeah, Harper was portrayed as I mean, it's not, I don't know if the people were even intelligent enough to remember that Mussolini was the leader of Italy during World War II. They would just say that like Bush was Hitler and Harper was Junior Hitler. And
so he can't even
be
the best bad. He can't even he's gonna be second rate.
Yeah, they couldn't even say he was like Goring compared to like, you know, the Austrian painter. But
but yeah, it's just these so Harper was so that was how like left wingers portrayed Harper back in the day. But still, just from my perspective, I view him as just sort of like a boring middle manager type of prime minister, relatively inoffensive. Even if he didn't stand up against social liberalism, he at least wasn't cheerleading it.
Which is a sin nowadays, but yeah, you're right. No,
I remember back in 2015 debating liberals on this, and yes, what they would would not say that there was like any particular policy he had that was terrible when it came to social issues. He would just say, or they would just say that, well, he doesn't march in pride parades, and if he doesn't march in pride parades, then like that's, I don't know, that's like a human rights abuse because he doesn't march in pride parades. And
then he had to. I remember he had to go to one.
And no, I don't remember if he ever actually did attend one. But yeah, no. So in one sense, I view him as sort of like a boring middle manager figure. But in another sense, I don't really think when it comes to any of these issues, there's really a significant difference between the liberals and conservatives. I'm not saying there aren't significant issues on some important issues. There are, I think, significant differences when it comes to spending and when it comes to natural gas and oil. So if you're particularly invested in either of those issues, then I guess that might make you want to vote for the conservatives or for the liberals, depending on which side of the issue you're on. But when it comes to these like larger civilizational issues, I don't think there really is any difference. So it's like, yeah, if Pierre Poilievre was prime minister, would he just be less annoying than Trudeau? Yeah, that's true. And maybe he's worth voting for just so like I don't have to cringe when I think about who our prime minister is. I think you could make an argument for that. But it's not actually going to make any significant change to these more long-term issues.
Yeah.
I stunned you with my brilliance.
Yes.
No, it's true. It's true.
And that's the thing. That's the thing about the main critique of like that the alt-right and kind of more broadly the dissident right and kind of the old right had before them, and kind of the 1930s before that time. kind of before they were destroyed, was that fundamentally they never use power like the left does. When the left uses power, they use power to absolutely destroy their enemies and cement their power for generations. They go after their enemies, with a knife to their throats. And when conservatives go in there, it's just like this pathetic, like, well, can you just kind of like stop beating us so badly? Yeah, you can like just like you can still have the gun and threaten to shoot us with it, and we'll just like keep the knife, because we're principled. And that's all conservatives really do. So they serve their function in the system very well, and that's why I hate conservatives now.
Yeah.
And I think we should all hate conservatives too, because they don't serve a role in actually helping us. They serve to help the role the system has for them, which is why they're tolerated, which is also why they're not put in prison, why people think that's coming. It's like, why would they be put in prison when they do the work of the enemy for them anyway?
Oh, 100%. But yeah, it's getting a bit late, but
it's getting a little bit for our Canadian friends here, and they gotta go pick they gotta go do their version of Starbucks pretty soon.
I would like to say I have one bit of one call out that I would like to say. I'd like everyone to please direct their attention not to the background image here, but to the thumbnail on this video. And I like everyone to like open it up and everything so you can see the thumbnail. And I would like to point out that clearly some Danish propagandist is behind the thumbnail of this video. Because as you can see, many of the islands in the north of Canada that are clearly a part of Canada have been marked in not red, which is in this map clearly representing Canada. Clearly, this is just the ongoing Danish invasion of Canada since they annexed the Hans Island, which Trudeau handed over to them, despite the entire island being rightfully Canadian territory. And a whole half of the rightful island, a Canadian island of Hans Island, just being given over to the Danes. Now, some Danish propagandist is claiming that a whole chunk of islands up in the north of Canada are rightfully Danish land, and that this is just something I absolutely cannot abide by. This is not something I can allow happen. I will not allow any of the Danes to try and conquer Canada like this.
I will forward that complaint from the world-famous Settler to the man who created that thumbnail. I'll write that down immediately for his immediate termination and silencing. But with that being said, our Canadian friends do have to go to what's that version of Starbucks you guys have? What's
Tim Hortons.
Yeah, you guys gotta go to Tim Hortons later anyway. So with that being said, this thing you like to show. Before we can close out the stream, this like world-defining stream of internet autism.
Well,
Settler,
I suppose number one thing I want to shill, considering the topic of this stream, is Autism Speaks. Please go to www.autismspeaks.com. Number two that I would like to shill is that it is absolutely necessary for the salvation of every human creature to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. And if you would like to sign up for RCIA, you should do that now because RCIA classes start in September. So do that if you so do that. Just do that. If you're not Catholic, become Catholic. It's as simple as that.
There you go.
What else? Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's pretty much it.
Favorite hockey team, Settler?
Nice try, Fed.
See, you thought. I can't help. I'm embarrassed to admit, but I'm a lifelong Leafs fan. As for shilling, listen, okay, I'm like a core millennial, so I grew up when the Leafs were amazing. When like I had a Ty Domi jersey, okay, when I was a kid. Anyways, last minute shilling. Tomorrow, I'm been the first in a while. I've done a Twitter space. But I'm hosting the Twitter space of the exhibition gallery that's happening with a bunch of our friends in the UK. My co-host will be Pharaoh, and I believe Fen de Villiers and Alexander Adams is going to come on. And speaking of Alexander Adams, this Wednesday I have the Alexander Adams content-minded episode will be dropping, where we talk about the work of art. We talk about his art in particular, and we sort of like not do the usual like culture war politics thing, although there's still a little bit of that. And then, of course, every Thursday is Digital Archipelago. So we're on Prude's channel, Prudential's channel this week before he does his, I can never pronounce it, Scaldings event?
Shieldings.
Shielding. Wow, whatever.
Whatever.
Maybe I'll go one day, maybe next year. But yeah, like before the event next week, I believe. So yeah, it's on his channel this week, and I don't know, maybe next week we'll pre-record something. So yeah, big content week. So it's gonna be good.
Yeah, you should be checking out his streams, Anons. If you're not watching Digital Archipelago every week, Anons, you're not gonna make it. It's as simple
Exactly.
as that. You need to be, you need to be following
The top of
Christ
the
first,
sector.
and then after you follow Christ, you need to be watching Digital Archipelago, or you're not gonna make it. It's as simple as that.
We are the top of the sector. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, gentlemen, I really enjoyed having this stream with you. I really enjoyed this discussion. I'm sure our Anons really enjoyed it. With that being said, the annexation of Canada is inevitable. You will become a part of the American Empire, whether you like it or not. And have a good night.